The water off the coast of Espiritu Santo is clear enough that you can see the bottom before you even hit the surface. You slip in from the boat about 15 meters from shore, equalize once, and start down. The coral begins almost immediately, vivid, healthy, the kind of reef that draws divers from across the world. Parrotfish dart between formations. A turtle cruises the edge of your vision, indifferent. At 5 meters, the light is still strong, the Pacific sun cutting through in long yellow columns. Then, at around 10 meters, you see it. A steering wheel, still mounted to its column, the metal oxidized and furred with coral, but the shape unmistakable. You follow the column down, and it leads to a dashboard, the dashboard to a cab frame, the cab frame to a truck body the size of a house. And suddenly you understand that you are not above a reef at all. You are above a junkyard. A military junkyard sitting on the floor of the South Pacific that has been here since 1945. Trucks stretch as far as the visibility allows. 40-50 meters of them, stacked and tumbled, wheels pointing skyward, cab frames fused together by 80 years of coral growth. Between the trucks, bulldozers with their blades still raised. Forklifts, 6-wheel drive military transports, a crane, semi-trailer frames with their double rear axles standing nearly vertical, wheels in the air like rusted windmills, jeeps with their steering columns intact, ambulances still identifiable by their body shape, now home to angelfish and lionfish, and creatures that have no memory of what these machines once were. And then, scattered across the whole site like the strangest possible detail, glass bottles, Coca-Cola bottles, sealed and intact, resting on the seafloor of the South Pacific 80 years after someone loaded them onto a ship in the continental United States and sent them to the other side of the world. This place is called $1 Million Point. It sits just off the shore of Luganville, the only town of any size on Espiritu Santo, the largest island in the archipelago, now known as Vanuatu. The name is something of an understatement. The U.S. government's own estimates, even at 1945 prices, put the value of what lies on this seafloor in the hundreds of millions of dollars. In today's money, the figure runs to billions. The question that every diver carries back to the surface is the same one. Not what is this? That part is visible. The question is, how? How does a military superpower, at the peak of its wartime production capacity, fresh from the most expensive conflict in human history, load up billions of dollars of equipment, drive it down a ramp, and push it into the sea? Deliberately, methodically, over the course of days, with a crew assigned to do nothing else? The answer requires going back to a morning in December 1941, to a small island that nobody outside of a few colonial administrators had ever heard of, and to the particular chain of decisions, strategic, financial, diplomatic, and finally petty, that turned a forgotten piece of jungle into the second largest American military base in the Pacific, and then into an underwater museum that nobody planned. In 1941, Espiritu Santo did not appear on any American war map. It had no reason to. The island is the largest in a chain of roughly 80 islands in the South Pacific, sitting about 1,750 kilometers east of Australia. The Spanish had named it in 1606, La Australia del Espiritu Santo, the southern land of the Holy Spirit, but the name outlasted any Spanish interest. By the 20th century, the island chain was administered as the New Hebrides, a colonial territory shared awkwardly between Britain and France, under an arrangement so convoluted that locals referred to it not as a condominium, but as a pandemonium. There were two currencies, two police forces, two sets of laws, two prison systems. The only institution the two colonial powers shared was a single joint court. Everything else existed in duplicate British and French, parallel and non-communicating. The native Ni Vanuatu people, roughly 40,000 of them across the entire archipelago by the early 1940s, lived inside this colonial structure without belonging to it. They were, under the condominium's rules, officially stateless. To travel between islands, they needed documents countersigned by both the British and French resident commissioners. Their land had been absorbed into coconut plantations run by European settlers. Their labor sustained an export economy that sent its profits elsewhere. Espiritu Santo itself had no roads to speak of, no airstrips, no port capable of handling anything larger than a coastal trader. The economy was coconuts. The population of the island was a fraction of the archipelago's total. A French colonist who arrived in the New Hebrides during this period later described the shock of encountering the American military. If Martians had landed among us, we would not have been more surprised. He was talking about what came after December 1941. Before that, there was nothing on Espiritu Santo to be surprised by. It was an island doing what colonial islands did, producing a commodity crop for distant markets, governed by an administration that existed primarily on paper, noticed by nobody. Then, on the morning of December 7th, 1941, the Japanese Navy attacked Pearl Harbor, and the entire logic of the Pacific changed in a matter of hours. The attack destroyed or damaged 8 American battleships, killed 2,403 Americans, and eliminated in one morning the United States' sense of invulnerability in the Pacific. What followed was not merely entry into the war. It was the overnight collapse of a defensive perimeter that American strategic planners had spent years building. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, Japan had seized Guam. Wake Island fell on December 23rd after a 16-day defense. The Philippines were invaded. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day. By April 1942, Japan controlled a defensive arc stretching from the Western Aleutians to the Solomon Islands, a chain of territory that put Japanese air power within striking distance of Australia's northern coast. The American response required bases. Not bases in Hawaii, which was now a target. Bases further south, close enough to the fighting to be operationally useful, far enough from Japan's existing reach to be survivable. The supply lines from the American west coast to Australia, the route that kept Australia in the war, ran through the South Pacific. If Japan cut them, Australia was isolated. If Australia fell, the entire Southern Pacific became Japanese Lake. The geography of the war, suddenly and urgently, pointed to a cluster of islands that no American military planner had previously given a moment's thought. It pointed to the New Hebrides. It pointed directly at Espiritu Santo. In May 1942, the first American troops arrived on the nearby island of Efat. In late June, a 3-man reconnaissance team landed on Espiritu Santo and confirmed what the maps had already suggested. The island's second channel offered a deep, protected natural harbour capable of accommodating the largest warships in the fleet. The island's terrain could support airstrips. Its position, approximately 630 miles southeast of Guadalcanal, put it far enough from the Japanese advance to be a safe base, close enough to project air power into the fight. On July 8, 1942, a detachment of Seabees from the 1st Construction Battalion landed on the island and began clearing jungle. 20 days later, they had an airfield. This is where the story of Espiritu Santo really begins, not with the decision to leave, but with the decision to build. Because you cannot understand the scale of what was abandoned in 1945 until you understand what had been created in the 3 years before. And what was created was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary construction achievements of the Second World War. A military city, built from nothing, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, in less time than it takes most construction projects to clear planning permission. By the end of 1942, Espiritu Santo had 4 airfields, 3 hospitals, a floating dry dock capable of repairing battleships, fuel tank farms, ammunition bunkers, piers, roads, power plants, mess halls, cinemas, a bank, and a post office. Over 500,000 American servicemen and women would pass through it before the war ended. At its peak, more than 100,000 troops were stationed there simultaneously, more than double the entire native population of the archipelago. 9 million tons of military equipment would eventually be shipped to the island. The Eni Vanuatu who watched this happen described it with a word that translates, roughly, as witnessing the impossible made real. An island with no roads had roads. A coast with no harbour infrastructure had a floating, dry dock. A jungle that had never been cleared had 4 6,000-foot runways carved into it. The Americans had arrived, as the colonists said, like Martians. But Martians who brought with them everything a civilization needed and built it overnight, from scratch, in the middle of the South Pacific. They built it to fight a war. What they had not built, what no one had thought to plan, was any way to leave. That problem was still 3 years away. But it was coming. And when it arrived, it would produce a decision so strange, so specific in its pettiness, and so consequential for the people who lived on this island, that the evidence of it still sits on the seafloor today. A Coca-Cola bottle, sealed, resting in 20 meters of Pacific water, 80 years, and counting after someone decided it was easier to sink it than deal with it. We'll get to that decision. But first, what was built here, and how, and why the Americans considered it the most important piece of ground in the Pacific? That story is next. On July 8, 1942, a detachment of Seabees from the 1st Construction Battalion came ashore on Espiritu Santo with a specific set of tools. 6 tractors, 2 scrapers, 1 grease truck, 1 fuel wagon, 3 weapons carriers, and a generator. That was it. No heavy grading equipment. No prefabricated structures waiting in crates. No established supply chain. Just those machines, the men who knew how to run them, 295 infantrymen, 90 Marines, and 50 Ni Vanuatu labourers who had been farming coconuts on this island a week earlier. Their orders were to build a 6,000-foot runway in 20 days. They worked around the clock, 2 shifts, no rest days, lumen lights strung from the generator after dark, so the clearing never stopped. The island fought back. The jungle on Espiritu Santo is not the cinematic kind, all cathedral light and navigable gaps. It is dense, wet, and aggressive. The kind of growth that begins reconquering cleared ground the moment you stop cutting. The annual rainfall on Santo averages 90 inches. The soil in the lowlands, once stripped of its root systems, turns to the consistency of engine oil in rain. And it rained. They cut the coral out of the limestone ridges by hand and by machine, crushed it, and used it to surface the runway. Coral was everywhere on the island, ancient reef exposed by tectonic lift, and it served as the closest thing to free building material that the operation had. Where coral was not available, they laid Marsden steel matting, perforated steel planking, designed to interlock into a firm surface over unstable ground. On July 28, 1942, exactly 20 days after the first Seabee stepped off the landing craft, the 1st Fighter Squadron came in to land at what was now called Turtle Bay Airfield. The following day, B-17 flying fortresses of the 26th Bombardment Squadron landed behind them. On July 30th, those same B-17s flew their first combat mission, bombing the Japanese airfield under construction on Guadalcanal, 630 miles to the north, 20 days from jungle to operational bomber base. That is the fact that establishes the baseline for everything that follows on this island. In August 1942, the 7th Construction Battalion arrived on Santo with heavier equipment and a longer mandate. In 60 days, they completed a 2nd airfield, then a 3rd. By early 1943, there were 4 operational fields on the island. Turtle Bay, Bomber Field No. 1 at Pelliculo Bay, Bomber Field No. 2 at Pacoa, and a 5th strip outside Luganville, with runways ranging from 4,500 to 7,000 feet, served by miles of taxiways and dozens of aircraft revetments. 3 of the fields were designed to handle heavy bombers. 1 handled fighters and carrier aircraft. The Royal New Zealand Air Force operated from the same runways alongside the Americans. But the airfields were only the most visible part of what was being constructed. Simultaneous with the runway work, the Seabees were building a city. The harbour at Segund Channel, directly off the coast of Luganville, was deep enough to accommodate any vessel in the U.S. Navy's inventory. The Seabees turned it into a working port. Piers and wharves went in along the waterfront. Then the floating dry docks arrived, not 1, but 3, including ABSD class advanced base sectional dry docks that could be towed across the Pacific in sections, assembled at the harbour, and used to haul battleships and aircraft carriers out of the water for repair. This was the capability that made Santo indispensable. A damaged carrier no longer had to limp back to Pearl Harbor or Sydney. It could be patched and relaunched here, 630 miles behind the front line, within weeks rather than months. When the carrier USS Enterprise took torpedo damage in the Solomons campaign, she came back to Espiritu Santo for repairs. When cruisers took hits, they came to Santo. The fleet used it the way a long-distance runner uses a support vehicle. Constantly, without pause, without the run ever stopping. The fuel infrastructure alone represented an engineering achievement that had not existed anywhere in the South Pacific before 1942. Tank farms were constructed across the island's southeastern corner, storing oil, diesel, aviation gasoline, and marine fuel in quantities that could sustain extended fleet operations. The water distillation plant, drawing from island wells, produced 500,000 gallons of fresh water daily, for drinking, for the hospitals, for the ships. Power plants went up. Telephone lines ran between every major installation. Roads, sealed, graded, properly drained, connected the airfields to the harbour to the supply depots. Roads built on an island that had no paved surface at all 18 months earlier. Then there were the hospitals. 3 of them, full-scale military medical facilities capable of serving 70,000 patients in aggregate. Wounded men from Guadalcanal, from the Solomons, from the sea battles in Iron Bottom Sound, were flown or shipped back to Santo for treatment. The island was far enough from the front to be stable, close enough for rapid evacuation. It functioned as the primary medical rear area for the entire South Pacific campaign. The operating theaters and recovery wards were built in the same style as everything else on the base. Quonset huts, the semi-cylindrical corrugated steel structures that became the visual signature of American military occupation across the Pacific. Cheap, fast to assemble, functional to a fault, and absolutely unsuited to the aesthetic of the tropical paradise surrounding them. By 1943, the base at Espiritu Santo had also acquired a bank, a post office, a cinema, a telephone exchange, and an officers' club. Mess halls capable of feeding tens of thousands of men operated on shift schedules. The base had its own newspaper. It had a chapel. It had a laundry. For a brief and improbable period, this island in the South Pacific, which had nothing but coconut trees 3 years earlier, was more densely and completely serviced than many small American cities. The Americans called the base buttons. The name was part of the broader Pacific code system. All advance bases were given simple, unrelated names to prevent enemy signals intelligence from mapping the supply network. Buttons was the base. Roses was the secondary installation on the nearby island of Ifate. Together, they processed 500,000 American service members between 1942 and 1945. At the height of the build-up, more than 100,000 troops were on Santo simultaneously. On an island whose entire pre-war population had been under 5,000. The Ni Vanuatu watched this happen from the edges. 10,000 of them were recruited into the Vanuatu Labor Corps, working alongside the Americans in construction and logistics, earning wages for the first time in their lives. They were struck by things the Americans took for granted. The volume of food, the machinery that could lift what no man could lift, the fact that black and white American soldiers ate in the same mess halls, an equality invisible to the Americans, but revolutionary to a population living inside the explicit racial hierarchy of French and British colonial rule. What the Ni Vanuatu experienced in those years, the sudden proximity to industrial wealth on a scale they had never imagined, would shape their culture and their politics for generations afterward in ways the Americans never considered, because the Americans were not thinking about the long term. They were thinking about Guadalcanal. Espiritu Santo was selected as the headquarters and primary staging ground for Operation Watchtower, the Allied invasion of Guadalcanal, from the very beginning. The logic was geography. Santo sat 630 miles southeast of Guadalcanal, far enough to be outside the range of Japanese land-based air power operating from the Solomons, close enough to project B-17S fighters and naval forces directly into the fight. It was the hinge on which the entire Southern Pacific campaign turned. The Guadalcanal campaign ran from August 7th, 1942 to February 9th, 1943. 6 brutal months of land, air, and sea fighting that the Americans eventually won at a cost of approximately 7,100 men, 29 ships, and 615 aircraft. Throughout those 6 months, Espiritu Santo was the essential backstop. When Henderson Field was so badly bombed that its fuel supply was destroyed, C-47s flew gasoline from Santo. When carrier squadrons were mauled and needed aircraft, they came to Santo. When surface warships took damage in the night battles that filled Iron Bottom Sound with wrecked steel, they came to Santo's dry docks. The base was not a supporting element of the Guadalcanal campaign. It was the logistical foundation without which the campaign could not have been sustained. But something began to shift in late 1943 that would ultimately determine Santo's fate as completely as Pearl Harbor had determined its creation. The Japanese were pushed off Guadalcanal in February 1943. The Allies pushed north through the Solomons. MacArthur's forces pushed west along New Guinea. By late 1943, the front line had moved so far north that Santo was no longer the primary staging area for anything. The island did not stop being useful. It continued to process men and supplies, continued to repair ships, continued to function as a rear area logistics hub and medical facility. Part of the invasion fleet for Okinawa in 1945 would stage from Espiritu Santo, its last significant operational act. But the front was gone. The base that had been, in 1942, the closest thing to the fighting the Americans could safely establish, was now at the extreme rear of a line that stretched to within striking distance of Japan itself. New bases had been built further north, closer to the action, at Manus, at Ulithi, at Saipan and Guam. Those were the hubs now. Santo was the trailing edge, maintained because the machinery of a military base, once fully operational, is easier to keep running than to shut down, and because no one had yet had to think about how you shut it down. That thinking was coming. By the time it arrived, there would be 9 million tons of equipment on the island, and the men who had delivered it would all want to go home. But first, a surrender had to happen on the other side of the planet, on a battleship in Tokyo Bay, that nobody in 1942 could have predicted, and nobody in 1945 was fully prepared for. That surrender changed everything, including, in ways nobody anticipated, what would happen to the island of Espiritu Santo. At 7 p.m. on August 14th, 1945, Washington time, President Harry Truman stood before reporters in the White House and announced the unconditional surrender of Japan. The Pacific War was over. The news reached Espiritu Santo the way all decisive news reached the base, through the communications relay, then by word of mouth along the corridors of the Quonset huts, across the mess halls, out to the airfields and the dry docks and the fuel tank farms. The men on the base had been expecting to fight a land invasion of the Japanese home islands. Military planners had projected the invasion codenamed Operation Downfall, would cost between 250,000 million American casualties. The battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa, still fresh in 1945, had made every man in the Pacific theater very clear about what Japanese defensive fighting looked like at close quarters. The war had been expected by most Pacific veterans to continue well into 1946, possibly longer. It ended on an August Tanlust evening with a radio announcement. The immediate reaction across the Pacific was relief on a scale that does not have an adequate English word for it. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, would later describe what followed as not a demobilization, but a rout. Within 4 days of the formal surrender signing aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd, Fleet Admiral Ernest King authorized combat ships to begin carrying American troops home. The operation was codenamed Magic Carpet. At its peak, in December 1945, nearly 700,000 men were being repatriated from the Pacific in a single month. Aircraft carriers had 5-tiered bunks installed on their hangar decks. Battleships were converted to troop ships. Nobody cared about the conditions. They were going home. The men on Espiritu Santo were going home too. And that created a problem that nobody, in the 3 years of building the base, had thought to solve. There were 9 million tons of military equipment on the islands of the New Hebrides. That number needs to sit by itself for a moment before the surrounding context is added. 9 million tons. Not 9 million items. 9 million tons of weight. Vehicles, machinery, fuel stores, ammunition, medical supplies, food, clothing, furniture, tools, spare parts, construction materials, communications equipment, weapons, aircraft, naval components, and the entire physical infrastructure of a military city that had been receiving supply shipments continuously since mid-1942. 3 years of American industrial production, poured without pause into a South Pacific island, had produced a quantity of material that defied easy categorization. The formal mechanism for dealing with this inventory was called Operation Roll-Up, administered through the Foreign Liquidation Commission, an agency of the U.S. State Department, working in coordination with ComServPac. Commander, Service Squadrons, Pacific Fleet. Under the Surplus Property Act of 1944, military units were required to declare their excess above defined reasonable stock levels, and the Commission would then investigate disposal options and issue final instructions. This was the process that was supposed to produce orderly, accountable disposition of the Pacific's surplus war material. The process ran into reality almost immediately. The first problem was the crates. Much of the inventory on Espiritu Santo had arrived labeled for wartime distribution, labeled for the specific mission, the specific unit, the specific operational context that had since ceased to exist. Reorganizing that inventory into a sellable or shippable catalog would require manpower. But the manpower was on the ships going home. The men who knew where things were, which crates held what, which stores were salvageable, and which had been destroyed by 3 years of tropical humidity. Those men were being discharged, at one point 2 million per month, back in the continental United States. What remained on the island was a skeleton crew trying to manage an inventory designed for a force 100 times its size. The second problem was the jungle. Espiritu Santo receives 90 inches of rain per year. Much of the material that had been stored in open-air depots or in temporary structures, or simply stacked under tarpaulins in the jungle clearings, had been doing so in that rain for 3 years. Rubber degraded, the fabric rotted, electrical systems corroded, metal rusted. Some of what was documented as inventory no longer existed in any functional sense. It existed on paper. What it had become physically was compost. The third problem was arithmetic. The U.S. War Department had looked at the question of shipping the Santo inventory home and done the calculation. The cost of transporting the material across the Pacific exceeded the market value of the material. This was not close. The shortfall was substantial. Even the equipment in good condition, the vehicles that started, the machinery that functioned, the tools that had been properly stored, was not worth shipping, because bringing it home would flood a domestic market that was already saturated with returning war production and would depress the prices being received by American manufacturers who had geared their entire operations for wartime output. The War Department did not want hundreds of thousands of surplus military trucks competing with the new trucks rolling off American assembly lines. The economy at home could not absorb the return of 9 million tons of Pacific surplus without damaging the industries it had been built to support. The decision that emerged from this calculation was straightforward. The equipment would not be shipped home. It would stay on the island. The question was what to do with it there. The most logical answer: sell it to the parties who would remain on the island once the Americans left, ran directly into a piece of colonial politics that would ultimately determine the fate of everything. Espiritu Santo was not American territory. It was a joint British and French colonial possession, administered under the Anglo-French condominium. When the Americans departed, the condominium administrators, Britain and France, would resume authority over the island. They were the natural buyers. They were also, having just fought and won a 6-year world war, essentially broke. Britain was carrying a national debt that would take decades to clear. France was rebuilding a country that had been occupied, fought over, and physically destroyed. Neither government had surplus cash to spend on military equipment in the South Pacific. The U.S. offer addressed this directly. The entire Espiritu Santo inventory, the vehicles, the machinery, the tools, the stores, everything that could be moved or sold, was offered to the British and French administrations at 6 cents on the dollar. Not $6 on the dollar. 6 cents. A truck that cost the American taxpayer $1,000 to manufacture and ship to the Pacific could be acquired by the British or French colonial administration for $60. The entire base inventory at that rate represented a fraction of its replacement cost, a genuine bargain for two powers who would need to rebuild infrastructure across their colonial holdings in the Pacific for years. Both Britain and France said no. Their calculation was not complicated. The Americans had 9 million tons of equipment on an island they were leaving. The ships available under Operation Magic Carpet were prioritizing men over material. The skeleton crew remaining on Santo could not catalogue, guard, or manage the inventory at any meaningful scale. Britain and France had watched the Americans build buttons from nothing in 3 years. They understood the operational reality. They concluded reasonably that the U.S. military could not move 9 million tons of equipment out of the South Pacific before it had to abandon the base. If they simply waited, if they declined the offer and let the timeline run, they would inherit the inventory for free when the last American ship left. It was a rational calculation. It was also, as it turned out, a catastrophic miscalculation. Because the Americans read it, they understood precisely what Britain and France were doing. The two colonial powers had looked at the U.S. offer, calculated that the Americans were bluffing, and called the bluff. Three wartime allies, the nations that had fought the same war, depended on each other's resources to fight it, and shared a base that had sustained the Pacific campaign, had arrived at a diplomatic standoff over who would blink first over the inheritance of military surplus. The standoff had a resolution. It was not the one Britain and France expected. On Espiritu Santo, sometime in the months between Japan's surrender and the base's formal closure in February 1946, someone with authority issued an order. The order was not framed as spite. It was framed as these things always are, as logistics, as the practical disposition of surplus that could not be sold, could not be shipped, and could not simply be left in place for a colonial administration that had refused to pay for it. The order was to destroy it. Not all of it. Not in one day. Over time, methodically, as the remaining personnel worked through what the Foreign Liquidation Commission's final disposal instructions described in the passive, bureaucratic language of official documentation. The military report on Operation Roll-Up, compiled in 1948, specifically mentions the underwater disposal of ammunition at $1 million point. 75 500-pound bombs, 250 projectiles, 250 cases of ammunition dumped at sea in May 1947, with a further 60 tons of bombs from Efate dumped in July. The report notes these disposals as routine. It does not dwell on what else went into the water. What else went into the water was not ammunition. What else went into the water was everything. And the manner in which it went in, the concrete ramp, the drivers jumping free at the last second, the men who stood on the shore and watched, some of them weeping, that is the next chapter. But before we get there, it is worth sitting for a moment with the specific shape of what had just happened. A war had ended. A base had become immediately obsolete. The logic that created it, the strategic necessity, the geographic calculation, the urgent need for exactly this island in exactly this location, had evaporated in a single radio announcement. What remained was the physical evidence of 3 years of industrial effort, sitting in a tropical jungle, losing value to the rain by the week. The men who could manage it were going home. The governments that could have bought it had chosen not to. The department responsible for disposing of it had a bureaucratic framework, a skeleton crew, and a set of instructions that pointed in only one direction. The math had been done. The answer was the ocean. The only question left was how long it would take, and who would watch. The Seabees, who remained on Espiritu Santo after the bulk of the force went home, were among the best construction engineers the U.S. military had ever produced. They had arrived on this island in 1942 with 6 tractors and built an airfield in 20 days. They had laid 4 runways, assembled floating dry docks, carved roads through jungle that had no roads, They had built a city from raw materials and will, and a deadline that allowed no margin. Now, in the months following Japan's surrender, they built a ramp. It ran from the shoreline, just outside Luganville, into the Seagond Channel. A concrete incline, sloped and surfaced, designed to allow vehicles to drive into the water under their own power. It was functional, efficient, and precisely engineered for its purpose. The CBs knew how to build things that worked. This one worked. Every day, drivers climbed into trucks, jeeps, ambulances, bulldozers, and tractors, drove them to the top of the ramp, accelerated down the slope, and jumped clear at the last second before the vehicle hit the water. The channel received them. Engine blocks, still warm from the drive across the base, cracked when they met the sea. Steam rose from the water. The vehicles sank, some quickly, some slowly, some tipping sideways as they went down, and settled on the sea floor in 10 to 25 meters of Pacific water, joining everything that had gone before them. When vehicles could not drive themselves, when the machinery was too large, too damaged, or simply needed to be moved in bulk, bulldozers pushed them to the edge and over. Some accounts describe rocks being placed on accelerator pedals, the engine running flat out as the vehicle went in. Then the bulldozers themselves were driven down the ramp, the operators jumping free in the same last-second routine, and the bulldozers joined what they had pushed. Travel writer Thurston Clark, who documented the scene from accounts of those present, described what he found. The CBs locked the wheels and jumped free at the last second. Engine blocks cracked and hissed, and some CBs wept. That detail, the weeping, is the one that has stayed in the historical record. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is specific. These were not sentimental men. The CBs were tradespeople, electricians, iron workers, carpenters, engineers, who had spent their careers treating machinery as a tool rather than an object of attachment. They had built this base with those bulldozers. They had carved the runways and laid the roads and assembled the infrastructure that had sustained the Pacific Campaign, and they had done it with those machines. Watching them go into the water was not an abstraction. It was watching the instruments of their own work destroyed in front of them, for reasons that had nothing to do with the war they had come here to fight, and everything to do with a diplomatic standoff between three governments that none of them had voted for. The base was formally abandoned in February 1946. The dumping operation is documented in the historical record as occurring between August 1945 and as late as December 1947, with different stages of the disposal process unfolding across that window. The concrete ramp itself, the final object the Army engineers built on Espiritu Santo, was blown up after the dumping was complete, so that the wharf infrastructure could not be used by whoever came next. That final act of demolition is worth sitting with. The Americans did not simply leave. They destroyed the means of access to what they had destroyed. They left a point on the coast of a South Pacific island with no way to retrieve what lay beneath it, and then they left. The Ni Vanuatu who watched this happen occupied a specific and impossible position in the event. They had lived with the Americans for 3 years. 10,000 of them had worked in the Vanuatu Labor Corps alongside U.S. forces, building the base, maintaining the infrastructure, doing the physical work that the construction program required. They had been paid wages for the first time in their lives, wages that exceeded anything the British or French colonial economy had ever offered. They had eaten American food, worn American clothes that the soldiers gave them, received American medical care from the base hospitals. They had observed, up close and daily, a way of organizing wealth and distributing it that was entirely unlike the colonial economy they had been born into. And they had watched it disappear into the sea. What the Ni Vanuatu registered was not primarily a diplomatic dispute between America and two European powers. What they registered was the destruction of wealth, real, physical, functional wealth, on a scale their island had never seen and would not see again in their lifetimes. Jeeps that could carry goods across the island, bulldozers that could clear land for agriculture, ambulances that could move sick people to medical care, unopened boxes of clothing, cases of Coca-Cola, still sealed, all of it going into the water while the people who could have used it stood on the shore watching. Some of the Americans understood this. Witness testimonies from the period record that U.S. personnel attempted to give civilian items, pots, pans, timber, guns, directly to the Ni Vanuatu before the disposal operation completed. These attempts were intercepted by the British colonial administration, which confiscated the goods. Items that had been offered to the islanders and taken home were recovered. In some instances, the confiscated material was itself burned or thrown into the sea by condominium authorities who were determined that the restoration of colonial order should not be complicated by a sudden infusion of American goods into the indigenous economy. Islanders who had accepted anything from the Americans, even material already categorized for destruction, were punished. The colonial calculus was explicit and not complicated. The Anglo-French condominium had spent decades constructing a social and economic system in which the Ni Vanuatu were dependent on the European administration for wages, goods, and access to the formal economy. The American presence had spent 3 years demonstrating that this dependency was not inevitable, that these people could be paid fairly, treated with basic respect, and given access to material wealth without the colonial apparatus as intermediary. When the Americans left, the condominium intended to reinstall the prior arrangement. Allowing the Ni Vanuatu to retain American goods would complicate that reinstallation. The goods were confiscated. The colonial relationship was restored. The sea received everything else. Ironically, and the history of this island is full of ironies that cut in multiple directions simultaneously, the Ni Vanuatu did not blame the Americans for the destruction. According to multiple accounts from the period, they blamed the British. They had watched the Americans attempt to give things away and been prevented. They had watched the British and French refuse to buy equipment that could have served the island, and then watched that equipment go into the ocean. Their anger resolved not toward the force that built the ramp, but toward the force that had prevented the alternative. This distinction matters because it shaped what came next. The cultural response to the departure, the cargo cults, the growing anti-colonial sentiment that would eventually produce an independence movement. But that belongs to the final chapter. Here it is sufficient to note that the Ni Vanuatu witnesses to the dumping were not passive observers of an event that happened to them. They were people with a precise understanding of what was being destroyed, and a precise understanding of who was responsible for the fact that they could not have it. The waters off Luganville were contaminated after the dumping completed. Fuel, rubber, motor oil, and metal waste leached from the submerged vehicles into the channel. The immediate environmental impact was visible to anyone on shore. A slick on the water, a smell in the air, the particular quality of a coastline that has received something it was not designed to receive. The Vanuatu salvaged what they could once the Americans departed. They waded in, they dove, they retrieved what was accessible in the shallows. Some of the material that sits on the seafloor today, the trucks standing nearly vertical with their wheels in the air, the bulldozer blades raised as if still waiting for a task, was inaccessible to anyone without diving equipment. The channel was not a shallow lagoon. It was deep enough to take what went in and hold it permanently. Over the following decades, the contamination receded and the marine environment adapted. Coral began colonizing the metal surfaces. Fish moved into the spaces between the vehicles, using the cab frames and chassis as artificial reef structure. What had been dumped as waste became habitat, not by design, not as an act of environmental remediation, but because the ocean has a specific and patient relationship with what is put into it. It does not judge the provenance. It simply incorporates. Today, the site is described by every dive operator on Espiritu Santo as one of the most extraordinary recreational dives in the world. The visibility in the second channel is clear enough, on most days, to see across the entire extent of the wreck field. Divers move through a landscape of rusted steel and living coral that has been 80 years in the making. A landscape that was created entirely by accident, by spite, by logistics, by a diplomatic standoff between 3 governments that have all since been replaced by other governments, over equipment that none of them ever used. At the far end of the ramp site, on the seafloor in about 15 meters of water, there are Coca-Cola bottles. Sealed. The glass has survived because glass does not rust. The contents have long since leached through the caps or the seals, but the bottles remain, the most mundane objects in the wreck field, and in some ways the most clarifying ones. Someone loaded those bottles onto a ship in the continental United States. Someone transported them across the Pacific to a supply depot on a South Pacific island. Someone stored them in a warehouse in a military city that processed 500,000 people. And then someone drove them down a concrete ramp and jumped clear at the last second and watched them go into the ocean. The base was formally closed in February 1946. The last American left. The condominium resumed authority. The jungle began with the patience that Espiritu Santo's jungle has always demonstrated to reclaim the edges of what had been built. And the question that nobody asked at the time, because there was no institutional mechanism to ask, no one whose job it was to consider it, was what any of this had meant to the 40,000 people whose island it was. The people who had built the base alongside the Americans, who had watched 100,000 soldiers cycle through their home, who had seen wealth beyond their conception, arrive and depart and disappear into the sea, and who now lived again under the colonial administration that the Americans had temporarily set aside. That question would not stay unasked for long. The island would not let it. There is a wreck in the Second Channel that predates $1 Million Point by 3 years, and it did not get there by spite. The SS President Coolidge was one of the most luxurious passenger liners ever built in America. Launched in 1931 by the Newport News Shipbuilding Company, she carried 990 passengers across the Pacific in Art Deco comfort. 2 saltwater swimming pools, a gymnasium, a barber shop, a beauty salon, a soda fountain. She broke speed records on the San Francisco to Manila route. Her interior was designed for a world that assumed peace was the natural condition of things. By late 1941, that world was gone. The U.S. War Department converted the Coolidge into a troop ship capable of carrying 5,000 men. On October 26, 1942, she was approaching the Second Channel off Espiritu Santo, carrying 5,340 American soldiers of the 172nd Infantry Regiment and 12,000 tons of military cargo, including 519 pounds of quinine. At that moment, the entire supply of the drug held by the U.S. forces in the Pacific. The harbor at Luganville had been mined against Japanese submarines. That information had been accidentally omitted from the Coolidge's sailing orders. Captain Henry Nelson, worried about enemy submarines and unaware of the minefield directly ahead, steered his ship into the channel's largest and most obvious entrance. At 9:30 a.m., the first mine detonated under the hull. A second hit near the stern 30 seconds later. Nelson immediately turned toward shore, attempting to beach the vessel before she went under, hoping the hull and cargo could be salvaged. The ship struck a coral reef 50 yards from the northern bank of the channel and stuck, not close enough to save her, but close enough that every man on board had time to get off. Over the next 90 minutes, 5,340 men walked, climbed, and swam ashore. There was no panic. Many were so certain the ship would be recoverable that they left their personal belongings behind. 2 men died. Fireman Robert Reed was killed in the engine room by the first explosion. Captain Elwood Joseph Ewart of the 103rd Field Artillery Regiment had already reached shore safely when he was told men were still trapped in the ship's infirmary. He went back through a sea door, found the men, and led them out. He could not get himself out after them. He went down with the ship and was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. His remains were recovered from the wreck in 2013, 71 years after the sinking, and given a full military funeral. The Coolidge listed to port, slid off the reef, and sank stern first into the channel at 10:53 a.m. She had been operational as a troop ship for less than a year. She had been sunk not by the enemy, but by her own side's minefield, due to a paperwork failure. The information about the mines missing from a single set of sailing orders. She lies there today in 20 to 70 meters of water, the largest accessible wreck dive in the world. The Vanuatu government banned salvage operations in 1983. She is officially protected. Divers who visit her report a ship that remains recognizable, the hull intact along most of its length, the Art Deco fittings still visible in places, the mosaic tile of the swimming pool floor still present beneath its coral. The lady, as divers call her, a ceramic sculpture of a woman mounted in the first-class lounge, is still there, undisturbed, in a room 60 meters underwater, in a ship that sank because someone forgot to include a map of the mines. Espiritu Santo, by 1946, had produced two of the most significant underwater archaeological sites in the Pacific. One was a luxury liner sunk by administrative error. The other was a billion-dollar military base driven into the sea by institutional spite. Both are still there. Both are now tourist attractions. Neither was planned. James Michener arrived on Espiritu Santo in April 1944, assigned to the island as a naval historian with the rank of lieutenant commander. He was 40 years old. He had no published books. He had spent his career as a teacher and an editor, and he had been sent to the South Pacific to collect historical records of the campaign, the dry administrative work of documenting a war in progress. What he found on Espiritu Santo was not dry. He found a base processing hundreds of thousands of men through a South Pacific island that most Americans had never heard of, in a theater of operations that the U.S. press covered less thoroughly than Europe, among people, the Eni Vanuatu, whose existence barely registered in the American public imagination. He found the specific texture of a war being fought in paradise, and the specific quality of what it did to the men who fought it. The boredom between engagements, the cultural collision between American servicemen and a Melanesian world they had no framework to understand. The relationships formed and broken across the racial and cultural lines that the war had scrambled without resolving. He took notes. He listened. He wrote 19 interconnected short stories while still on the island, drawing on what he had observed and heard, constructing a portrait of the South Pacific campaign from the ground up, not from the strategic overview, not from the battles, but from the experience of the people living in the spaces between the battles. He finished the manuscript in 1946, back in the continental United States, and submitted it to Macmillan. It was published in 1947. A first-time author, 40 years old, unknown to the literary world, with a collection of short stories set on an island most Americans could not locate on a map. In 1948, Tales of the South Pacific won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. The award committee, in order to give it the prize, had to change the name of the category from novel to fiction. The book was technically a story collection, and the rules had not anticipated something in that form being the year's best American literary work. They changed the rules. In 1949, Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein adapted the book into a Broadway musical. South Pacific opened on April 7, 1949, and swept the Tony Awards: Best Musical, Director, Author, Composer, Producer, Actor, Actress, Supporting Actor, Supporting Actress. It ran for 1,925 performances. A film version followed in 1958, a second film in 2001. The musical's songs, Some Enchanted Evening, Younger Than Springtime, Balihai, There Is Nothing Like a Dame, became part of the permanent cultural vocabulary of the 20th century. Hummed by people who had no idea they were humming something rooted in specific observations made by a naval historian on a specific island in the New Hebrides in 1944. The base Michener was stationed on closed in February 1946. Its runways are under jungle. Its Quonset huts are rotting or repurposed. Its roads are, in some places, still the only roads on the island. The floating dry docks have long since gone. The fuel farms are rust, the hospitals are gone, the songs are still playing. The Ni Vanuatu did not respond to the departure of the Americans with silence. Something had been set in motion during those 3 years that could not be unset by the condominium's restoration of colonial authority. 10,000 men had worked alongside American forces, earned wages, seen a different model of how human beings could be treated and compensated. They had watched 100,000 soldiers arrive with a material abundance that their island had never contained, had watched those soldiers treat them with a familiarity and an informal respect that the British and French colonial administration had never extended, and had then watched everything, the abundance, the soldiers, the wealth, and finally the physical equipment itself, disappear. The John Frum movement, centered on the island of Tanna in the southern archipelago, had roots that predate the American arrival. It emerged in the late 1930s as a syncretic religious and anti-colonial movement, part traditional belief and part rejection of the missionaries who had spent decades suppressing customary practices. But the American presence in 1942, the arrival of exactly the material abundance that John Frum had prophesied, the cargo planes and the ships, and the jeeps and the food, transformed the movement fundamentally. What had been an abstract prophecy became a confirmed one. The Americans had come, the cargo had come, and then they had both left. What followed in the late 1940s was a specific and strange form of grief expressed as ritual. On Tanna, followers of John Frum built symbolic airstrips, cleared ground, bamboo control towers, to encourage the planes to return. They marched in military formations, carrying bamboo rifles, imitating the drills they had observed the Americans perform. They painted USA on their chests. Every year, on February 15th, which became John Frum Day, they gathered at a village called Lamakara in the shadow of Mount Yasur volcano, hoisted the American flag, and waited. They are still waiting. As of 2022, the movement has fewer than 500 practitioners, largely confined to a single village. It is described in contemporary accounts as much diminished, a living remnant of something that once had genuine social force across multiple islands. But it has not disappeared. There are elders in Lamakara who can explain precisely, with theological rigor, what John Frum promised, and why the return has not yet come, and why the waiting continues. What the cargo cults represent, not merely the John Frum movement, but the broader pattern that emerged across Melanesia, wherever American forces arrived and departed, is a specific attempt by societies with no other framework available to make meaning of an encounter with industrial wealth that arrived without explanation and departed without apology. The Americans had not explained themselves on arrival because secrecy was the strategy. They had not explained themselves on departure because logistics was the priority. They had simply come, built the largest thing the islands had ever seen, and then gone, leaving behind the evidence of their presence and the absence of any account of what it meant. The Ni Vanuatu made their own account. They built it out of what they had observed. It was not accurate, in the sense that John Frum was not a literal American soldier messiah who would return with cargo. but it was not irrational either. It was a coherent attempt to explain an experience that had no coherent explanation. Vanuatu became an independent nation on July 30th, 1980, 35 years after the base at Espiritu Santo closed, 34 years after the last American left. The Ni Vanuatu, who had been officially stateless under the Anglo-French condominium, who had needed documents countersigned by 2 colonial administrations to travel between their own islands, now had a government of their own. The roads the Americans had built were still there. Some of the Quonset huts were still there. The airstrips, grown over with jungle, were still there in outline. And at the bottom of the Sigand Channel, in 15 to 25 meters of water, the jeeps and the bulldozers and the ambulances and the Coca-Cola bottles were still there too. Had been there all along. Were becoming, slowly, the reef that nobody planned, the habitat that arrived not as a gift, but as the consequence of a standoff, the accidental ecology of institutional spite. The site is now called $1 Million Point. The name is modest. The current estimates of the material's value, adjusted for inflation, run considerably higher than $1 million. But the name stuck because it captured something true about the scale of the absurdity. That this much had been destroyed, over this, at this location, and the location had received it all and kept it, and turned it into something that people now pay money to visit. Return, now, to the diver from the first page of this story. She descends off a boat 15 meters from the shore at Luganville, equalizes once, and starts down through clear Pacific water toward the seafloor. She finds the steering wheel first, still mounted to its column, the coral making a new skin over the old metal. She follows it down to the truck. She looks across the wreck field and understands, in the particular way, that physical evidence communicates what documents sometimes cannot, the scale of what happened here. The base was not abandoned overnight. That is the correction this story has been building toward since the first chapter. The word abandoned implies a departure without decision, a flight, a forgetting, a leaving behind in haste. What happened on Espiritu Santo was not that. It was methodical. It took years. It was bureaucratically authorized, logistically planned, and physically executed by engineers who built a concrete ramp specifically for the purpose of driving the equipment in. The Army engineers blew up the ramp when they were done. Someone made a decision about the ramp. Someone else countersigned it. The base was not abandoned. It was erased. And the erasing was the last act of construction the Americans performed on this island. The same Seabees who had built the airfields and the dry docks and the hospitals and the roads, now building a ramp to undo what they had built, and then demolishing the ramp when they were finished, so that what was left was a stretch of contaminated water, and beneath it, the physical record of a decision that nobody put in the official history. The official history says the base closed in February 1946. That is true. The official history does not explain, with any completeness, what happened to the 9 million tons. That requires looking at the seafloor. There are 2 things worth sitting with at the end of this story. Not conclusions. The history does not offer clean conclusions. But 2 things that the record holds and that the record does not resolve. The first is this. The largest American military base in the South Pacific without which the Pacific campaign of World War II could not have been sustained, is now a dive site. The second largest accessible wreck dive in the world is a luxury liner sunk by a missing piece of paperwork. The most documented material legacy of the American presence on the island is what they drove into the ocean out of spite. The cultural legacy, the John Frum movement, is still waiting in a village in the shadow of a volcano for something that is not coming. The second is this: nobody has ever been asked to account for what the departure cost the Ni Vanuatu. Not the British, who confiscated what the Americans tried to give away. Not the French, who declined to pay for equipment that a small island nation could have used for a generation. Not the Americans, who made the calculation and built the ramp and blew up the jetty and left. The colonial administration was restored. The cargo went into the ocean. The Ni Vanuatu waited for 35 more years under a system that treated them as stateless before their own independence arrived, without any apology attached to it for what had preceded it. The diver comes back up through clear Pacific water, past the steering wheel, past the truck, past the 80 years of coral that have grown over the 80 years of silence, and breaks the surface into the South Pacific sun. Below her, undisturbed, a Coca-Cola bottle rests on the seafloor of the Second Channel. It has been there since 1945 or 1946. It will probably be there long after the last account of this story has been told, and the last person who knows what it means has gone, and the coral has covered it entirely, and it is just a shape on the seabed that nobody recognizes anymore. That is what happens to the things that are driven in without ceremony and left without apology. The ocean keeps them, it just doesn't keep the story.